Well, that's a little meta. It's an ad for the show you're watching in the show you're watching. Can you imagine just lounging around watching My Hairiest Adventure and then all of a sudden, oh crap, I'm in one of these too? The following is an in-depth story analysis. If you haven't seen this episode, you might want to before watching this review. Like a lot of kids of my generation, I used to adore the Goosebumps books. Even then, I knew they weren't great literature and that I was enjoying them as a guilty pleasure. After all, I didn't sink my teeth into my first Goosebumps book until I'd already read classics like Treasure Island, The Invisible Man, and Robin Hood. For an 8-year-old, those were meat and potatoes, and Goosebumps was like an oatmeal cream pie or a Klondike bar. And yeah, I do all kinds of things to get to read a Goosebumps book. By late elementary school, when I thought of reading for pleasure as opposed to the stuff I was assigned in class, my mind instantly went to those scholastic, knock-it-out-before-bedtime young adult series. Animorphs was much the same thing, though despite the watered-down language, there was a lot more real story substance and characters I was invested in. Those also read really fast and didn't challenge on many levels, but were grounded in an ongoing, growing universe with a certain internal logic and a fairly original and creative mythology. I'll do a rewind on its TV adaptation sometime down the road, as the entirety of that, of course, fits squarely into the superhero genre. Goosebumps wasn't about telling a story that made you think, or even telling a real story at all. It was about, in the moment, making you feel something novel, like a haunted house for your brain. We didn't care if the stories really made any sense, or that they were all pretty derivative. It was all about the outlandish, horror-inspired concepts and the often surprise O. Henry endings. The protagonists were often generic and two-dimensional. It's often true with your standard horror movie schlock, too. You just need some regular sap to be our eyes into a scary tale and to give the monster or the serial killer somebody to chase after. And perhaps that's for very similar reasons in both cases. The protagonist is a random, uncomplicated everyman, so we can put ourselves in his or her place and insert ourselves into the fiction. If I'm relating to a character or care about what happens to them in a character-driven story that's really about that person, I'm likely to do that anyway. I don't need a character to be stock just so I can imagine I'm the one who's being chased or attacked or given a sadistic ultimatum designed to force me to saw my own legs off. But a lot of horror movies are meant to be chilling rides as opposed to stories about characters you find real and sympathetic. And in that way, the Goosebumps books are exactly like the genre that spawned them, only made for an age group that generally wouldn't have been allowed to watch those movies. It's actually a lot like going to an amusement park. We just weren't tall enough to get on those rides. So R.L. Stine did something that's kind of impressive. He created a phenomenon by giving kids horror stories their parents would actually let them read. If you really think about it, that's amazing. Kids don't want to read the stuff they're told are all ages books or kids' books. A lot of us were attracted by the forbidden. Telling a kid a movie is too violent or gory or vulgar for them and forbidding them to see it is like locking a box, setting it hardly out of their reach, and telling them they can't open it until they're 16. All the 16-year-olds they know got to unlock their boxes and have seen whatever new, strange, life-changing things that are hidden inside. And the kiddies have their own box without a lock that they can open anytime they want to, but it's the same fuzzy, happy, wholesome, cutesy stuff they've been playing with since they were babies. Kids want what they're not allowed to have yet, because having it makes them feel grown up, and not being allowed to have it makes them feel like the children they are. When I was 8 years old, I wanted to be 20. I thought I was ready for anything, and I wanted to prove it. Anytime my dad let me see a movie that was just a little rougher or darker than my mom probably would have let me see, or when I was at a friend's house whose parents were a little less strict than mine on what they allowed their kids to watch, it made me feel like I'd moved out of the house, and I owned my own car. Some of my most vivid memories are the first time I was exposed to things like The Terminator and Spawn, because I was told so many times I wasn't ready for those things, and often it turned out I really wasn't. But even though a lot of us were allowed to read the Goosebumps books because a lot of parents weren't beggars trying to be choosers, if it was in the Scholastic magazine and their kids actually wanted to read something, they bought them without another thought. they still somehow had a similar novelty as sneaking into a rated R movie. You still felt like you were getting away with something because your parents bought these things for you, you read them right in front of them, but often they wouldn't have any idea what was in them. I know my parents didn't, and these things were weird. Crazy, scary, mortifying things happened to people in these books. People had their souls stolen by cameras, or they were trapped in theme parks with monsters, or turned into bees, or stuck playing the piano forever. A lot of the time, everything turned out okay in the end, but sometimes still in twisted and disturbing ways. Attack of the Mutant is about a kid who's obsessed with comics and gets turned literally into a comic book character. The big reveal at the end is that despite clues that it might have been all a hallucination because he's too wrapped up in the worlds he's read about, he really is made of ink now. And that's how it ends. He doesn't get killed by the mutant or trapped in his headquarters for all eternity or stuck inside the pages of a comic, but it's sufficiently disconcerting, and that's kind of satisfying, at least when you're a kid. And again, even if the thing makes no sense whatsoever, it's made more exciting because of the familiar everyday backdrop and setup of a stereotypical preteen. I think that's why I liked Power Rangers so much as a kid. The heroes were always fighting putties and monsters in public parks and playgrounds, places I spent a lot of time at. They were kids, and they did all this when no one was around. They had the secret life that somehow no one else knew about, and they hid in plain sight. It was really easy at school to pretend you were leading this double life and the world depended on you, but you had to go about your day like nothing was different, so no one would ever find out you were really this masked hero who was going to save them all. Goosebumps had exactly the same thing. It was fun to imagine all these messed up things were lurking in the boring, mundane places you inhabited every day. You'd walk to school imagining finding a possessed camera, or even finding what came beneath the sink in your kitchen at home. R.L. Stine might have been writing popular, least common denominator fast food fiction, but he had an uncanny sense of what appealed to the preteen imagination, and walked a line between giving them something wholesome and harmless and giving them that weird, freaky, scary stuff they learned for whenever they saw a trailer for a Scream movie. The TV series served as a kind of Twilight Zone for kids, an anthology series with a new story and new cast every episode, each with a weird, impossible conceit to create an eerie situation. In the same way the books were a safe, age-appropriate alternative to Stephen King, this was an alternative for kids to horror anthology shows like Tales from the Crypt, and to an extent, and I only say this because of its usual episodic format, The X-Files. There were others of its kind too, like Are You Afraid of the Dark, and surprisingly, regardless of the success of that show, and unlike the later short-lived Animorphs, Goosebumps found an audience and lasted a full 4 seasons. Most of the books were adapted, though curiously, one of those omitted was Night of the Living Dummy, even though both sequels were made into episodes, and both still called Night of the Living Dummy 2 and Night of the Living Dummy 3. I didn't keep up with the series, but occasionally would tune in just to see how an episode adapted one of the books I liked. I remember not caring for what was done with One Day at Horrorland, but Attack of the Mutant kind of stuck with me. From seeing this as a kid, I remembered the Adam West cameo, the mutant's repetitive but relatively menacing villain laugh, and the liberty taken with the ending in adding that Skipper not only discovers he's still made of ink, but that he's also transformed into the hero he made up to trick the mutant into destroying himself, the colossal Elastic Boy. That was really unexpected, not just because it's different from the way the book handled it, but also because the kid who's always got his head buried in comics suddenly gets everything he ever wanted. It's sort of a happy ending, but something about the way it's shot and the fact that Skipper delivers an evil villain laugh makes the whole thing feel just wrong and unsettling. Even though he saves the day and gets to be a superhero, there's something about the way it happens for him here that's surreal and almost degenerates him into something less than human. I didn't want to be Skipper anymore by the end of the episode. The book ends on almost a cliffhanger that longs to be resolved. Without the superhero reveal, the last line feels like it's too ambiguous and abrupt of a resolution. I suddenly had the feeling that my comic book career wasn't over. In the show, that's interpreted as his life is a comic book now because he has superpowers. Again, it's not important why just making up a character gives him those powers, or what it means to be both made of ink in the real world and showing up as a drawing in a comic book. It's a more bizarre twist, and that's what we came to the show for. R.L. Stine has said this book has the best surprise ending of all of them. Interesting how the most substantial change in the TV version is to make that an even bigger reveal, and I think, a better one. The episode actually improves on a number of things from the book. The biggest one for me is the removal of all the silly made-up comic book collecting mumbo-jumbo. I'm not sure if R.L. Stine just didn't know much about comics, didn't do his homework, or was going off the popular pre-comic crash assumptions about the value of comics. But Skipper makes ridiculous claims in the book, like a Zero issue being worth 10 times more than a number 1 just because 0 comes before 1. I might be able to chalk that up to an unreliable narrator, a naive kid who thinks his collection of mostly current mass-produced comics is worth a fortune, but I can't be sure. After all, sometimes Stine absolutely nails the way a kid his age might look at things, like when he says he has to get his braces adjusted because they're getting too comfortable. That's a line I missed in the show. Along the same vein, I like the decision to leave out Skipper's collecting over reading mentality. In both versions, part of the reason he collects is because he thinks his comics are really valuable. But in the book, the extreme lengths Skipper goes to in keeping his comics in pristine condition begs the question as to how he could possibly be so caught up in the fantasies inside them that his friends and family would think he's had a break with reality. There, he claims the only book he reads is The Masked Mutant. Every other comic he keeps in its mylar bag, and he never opens it for fear of decreasing its value. But then, he knows everything about these characters and references comics he claims he hasn't read. Again, maybe he's an unreliable narrator, but why lie about reading some books and tell the reader you read The Masked Mutant? It's just awkward. Remember, this is before Wikipedia. He might have some other reference, but that's never, referenced. Both the book and the episode are interesting to examine as a product of the times in how the comic industry was perceived. The titular character of Skipper's favorite series is a villain, not a hero, who in the episode is drawn like your typical edgy Marvel or Image villain, and sometimes even has Violator's jaw. He never discusses any character's motivations or heroes he looks up to, or really anything about the stories beyond how cool and epic they are. He never comes out and says he likes them because there's a lot of brutality and carnage, but when he does point out a panel he really likes, it's usually all about the action. The Masked Mutant isn't a morally ambiguous anti-hero, and a superhero seems to defeat him, or at least gets away from him, every issue. But that's just because this is a relatively wholesome series meant for children. Comics in the 90s were often all about pushing the envelope on shock factor and violence, so it's no surprise to me that the big title Skipper likes most is about a bad guy. Of course, that could just be because this is supposed to be a scary book, and if he's going to capitalize on the popularity of superheroes in a Goosebumps book, it's probably no coincidence, by the way, that after 2 successful Batman movies, the mutant, as depicted on the cover, has a Batman-esque cape and cowl. Stine needs to find a horror angle, so a comic book villain is cast as the mysterious, shape-shifting boogeyman. There's only one token mention of any real-life licensed comic book properties in the book and in the TV show, and they're both different. In the book, it's 2 posters side by side in Skipper's room, one a Jack Kirby Captain America, and the other, of course, Todd McFarlane's Spawn. It's as if Stine is writing what he knows will be popular, but he wants to make sure to throw in a nod to his day and the kind of artist he once admired. A guy whose sensibilities were exploration and wonder and curiosity about what might be out there, what might someday exist, versus a guy all about pushing the boundaries of edginess and violence. In the show, instead of posters, we see a life-size cardboard cutout of Wolverine, arguably the other most popular rough-and-tumble hero of the 90s, appropriately placed there because he's a mutant, like the Masked Mutant, and possesses a near immortality, possibly foreshadowing Skipper's own immortalization as a comic book character at the end. There's one more nod to real comics in the book, and that's the name of the creator of the Masked Mutant, Jimmy Steranko, obviously named after the creator of the groundbreaking series Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. It's spelled wrong, and I don't know that the real Steranko ever went by Jimmy, but that's clearly who Stine is homaging. In the show, his name is changed to Ernie Atwater, who I don't think is a reference to anything, and I'm not sure why it was changed, unless it was assumed Steranko wouldn't like the nod associated with this kind of material. Oh wait, I guess that's probably who he's named after. The episode sets up story points for the audience in a way that a limited first-person POV narrative simply can't. Some revelations that seem to come out of nowhere in the book feel a little more logical here, yet still might take a newcomer to the story by surprise. For instance, we get glimpses of the Masked Mutant skulking around in bushes and standing on the roof of the bus Skipper rides at the beginning of the episode to establish that he's watching Skipper for some reason. So when he reveals that Skipper's new friend, Libby, who accompanies him to the Masked Mutant's mysterious hideout toward the beginning, isn't real and that he shapeshifted himself to look like her the whole time, we can think back to the bus and say, okay, Okay, that's why he was on the roof. And when Skipper is zapped with a strange light, which is later revealed to be what transforms him into an ink-based comic character, we only see it hit Skipper and not Libby, which adds to the mystery, but is also a subtle tip-off that something might be off about her. Why does the beam zap Skipper but not Libby? It feels like something was there all along, but that you might not pick up yourself. There's also something off about Libby, the way she theatrically over-enunciates every word. That might be a conscious choice, another clue that she's the mutant, or it might be one of those not-so-great performances that actually works in the episode's favor. On the other hand, that whole device is also problematic because the story cheats with the mutant's power. In one scene, he gets out of a room somehow as the masked mutant and is standing on the other side of the door immediately as Libby. He's a shapeshifter, but he can't teleport. And by showing the mutant coming out of Skipper's comic book at the beginning, without his seeing it, there's really never any doubt watching the episode that everything Skipper's seeing is real, whereas in the book, it could all be in his head. The only person who sees all the strange stuff Skipper does is Libby, but she turns out to be the villain that everyone else thinks he's hallucinating. So it's not until the final scene, when someone else we know for sure is real, his mother, sees him bleed ink, that we can be sure it's really happening to him. But since we're privy to supernatural events involving the mutant Skipper isn't in the TV episode, it's clearly really happening. And that's probably why the addition of the stretch powers and costume was added to the ending. The fact that he's still a comic character wouldn't be much of a reveal after we saw Skipper see the world in 4-color ink dots, and he was told by the mutant that he is a comic character. So seeing the mutant away from Skipper makes for more entertaining television, but by getting away from our protagonist, it takes away from the ambiguity of what's real or not, and distances us from the main character. But feeling like we're the ones experiencing this weird ride is never as effective on screen as it is in a book, where everything is happening in your own imagination. There's an interpretation through performances here, and often in this show, typical TV child acting, the quality of which varies wildly episode to episode. Again, the novelty of this show, I think, was more in seeing how these stories are translated to screen rather than enjoying them on their own. You don't have to read the books to understand what's happening, of course, and sometimes that doesn't help either, but the often nonsensical nature of the books just doesn't translate to television as a great standalone experience, in my opinion. So it's nice that Dan Warry-Smith is relatively convincing and seems genuinely unnerved and freaked out by this nightmare scenario he's in, without going too over the top with it. He seems a lot more relatable and courageous than the version in the book, and that performance, contrasted with the out-of-touch, totally self-absorbed and oblivious behavior of the parents, adds another layer to the whole thing that is kind of present in the book, but brought more to the fore here. Skipper's father thinks he spends too much time reading comics, and that they're going to rot his mind. In fact, several characters say that throughout the course of the episode, almost like Seduction of the Innocent was just published. But even though Skipper is supposed to be the one who's detached from reality, he's the most sane and rational character in the story. Everyone else is lost in his own little world. His best friend collects rocks, and I like that change from the stamp collector in the book, because the rocks are real and all around him, but he seems weirdly obsessed with them and barely mentally present, almost as if his head is filled with rocks. His father seems trapped in the 50s and seems to have no hobbies or interests whatsoever. He looks like an accountant, but tells Skipper he was never good at math. Wow. I mean, just look at that guy. If he doesn't like comics or math, I can't imagine what he's into. He's probably a rock collector too. And his mother, who just defers to her husband and seems to choose not to think for herself, is as engrossed in romance novels as her son is in comics. I'm not saying this Goosebumps episode is telling a great story or that it's brilliant satire, but I kinda love that. These parents are telling their kid that what he's reading is junk, but those shallow romance novels seem to have had a way more adverse effect on Skipper's mom than comics have on him. No one in the story feels real except for Skipper, and I'm not entirely sure what to take from that, if anything. It's neat to see it turning the "it's just a story, come back down to earth" message on its head a little. It might be generally saying that we should all try to retain some amount of that childlike wonder and open-mindedness about possibilities, and that adults tend to get so wrapped up in their own little worlds they regress back into children in a way. But Skipper doesn't change the world to become a little more down to earth through his rationally investigating seeing something strange, but it seems to really be happening in going to the mass mutant's lair and trying to rescue the galloping gazelle, he seems to live in an off-reality, as if he was in a comic book the whole time, and now that he's embraced how bizarre things are, he gets to help transform it into a more comic book world by being a superhero. But then that's not really what we have either, since he was transformed by a being from a comic book universe that came into the real world. By the end, he's just as weird and out there as everything else. So his reward for trusting his instincts and being heroic is just to get wrapped up in his own little world just like everyone else has? Perhaps the idea is that Skipper is too ensconced by comics and he is destined to wind up like all the other obsessed, oblivious people in his life if he doesn't come back down to Earth. And it doesn't matter that he braves the scary headquarters to save the gazelle, he's already gone too far by going into the headquarters in the first place. If he had left well enough alone and didn't let himself get trapped by the mutant, he'd have never stepped into the beam, and it doesn't matter that the comic book stuff really exists. He would never have gotten roped into it. Heck, maybe his imagination, at least in the TV version, is what brought the mutant to life in the first place, and the lesson is to be careful with just how far you let yourself get caught up in a fiction, so he literally becomes a part of it. I think that ending can be read a couple ways. Skipper is either being punished for getting too caught up in the comic book world by being turned into a comic character, or he's being rewarded for trusting his instincts that he'd stumbled upon something impossible but real, and since he thwarted the villain, he gets to be immortalized as a comic character. Or maybe it's just supposed to be a wacky plot twist, and I'm not supposed to think about it at all. The masked mutant lures Skipper to him because he knows everything about him, so he thinks he'll be a good foe for his next comic book, and good foes are so hard to find, he says. The first time Skipper goes inside the building, the mutant just messes with him, sending him down to the basement when he presses up on the elevator. And why would an elevator need up and down buttons inside the elevator car and floor number buttons? And he leaves original comic pages out that predict the future, like Isaac Mendez's Ninth Wonders from Heroes. But it doesn't show him saving a cheerleader, it shows him doing exactly what he's doing, looking at comic pages. I kind of wanted that to keep going. He's looking at a page of him, looking at a page of him, looking at a page of him. But if the mutant wants to trap Skipper, why not just kidnap him now? Why send him a published comic showing him entering the building to lure him back there, especially since he's already inkified him and he's already publishing the kid in the comic? Why does he need the kid there in order to put him in the comic? He doesn't physically put Skipper in the book. It's like he has to be made of ink and do things, and then whatever he does can be put into the comic. So whatever actually happens magically winds up on the page, I guess? So I guess I can see the mutant luring him back to make sure he tries to rescue the gazelle, even though he probably could have contrived some way to get him to do that in the first place. But if manipulating Skipper to do superhero stuff is how the comic gets made, why is the mutant's big plot to keep Skipper in the headquarters and never let him leave? That's not going to make for perpetual compelling drama month to month. Okay, so Skipper has to save the gazelle, so the mutant has an interesting plot and a worthy adversary for his comic. But how did the story work before he came out from the comic page? Where's this Ernie Atwater guy? Maybe Skipper should try to find him and see if the masked mutant has always made his own comic happen by doing stuff in reality that translates to the page. Oh, and how in the world does Skipper get a comic in the mail with his own person in it, and past the page of the gazelle tied up, he doesn't read on to see what happens? I mean, there are more pages. Are they blank? My natural inclination would be to read on and see if it goes badly in the comic so I could rectify it in reality. You know, just like in Heroes. The masked mutant is hilariously gullible. His only weakness is turning into liquid, which Skipper easily tricks him into doing more easily than Superman has ever gotten Mxyzptlk to say his name backwards. He says he's not really Skipper, he's Elastic Boy, and the only thing that can destroy him, I can't say kill, is sulfuric acid. Even though Skipper made that up, the mutant says he thought he looked familiar and immediately turns into the acid. Oh yeah, real scary villain there. The only reason no one in the League of Good Guys, could stop him for good is because they're all as daft as he is. The gazelle runs off after spinning around really fast just because he's getting old and somebody else showed up. Like I said, everybody, including the comic characters, are self-absorbed and not all there. The biggest reason to revisit this, of course, is the Adam West cameo. It was quite a coup that this show got him to do that. And of course, Adam West has had a long history of playing roles that homage his time on Batman. And the fact that it is Adam West is taken full advantage of in the dialogue. My favorite moment is when the Gazelle looks around at the mutants' control room, which vaguely calls back to the Batcave set and its elaborate setup and random gizmos, and says, "It's so overdone." I also love the absurdity of some of his dialogue, some of which I imagine might have been improv, like when he compares the mutants' headquarters to that of the League of Good Guys and says it's not as impressive. We have a soft drink machine. I really enjoyed revisiting both the book and the episode, both for the nostalgia and examining it 20 years later as a product of its time. It's hard to rate a thing like this because telling a logical story isn't its main objective, but then if it had gone somewhere with a satire about out-of-touch parents in a world that doesn't understand its children, there would be a lot more to it than just another, ooh, spooky, somebody turned into something else, horror sketch. I do think it ultimately makes less sense than some of the other Goosebumps efforts beyond the initial supernatural conceit, and it feels padded in places, stretching for time to fill 2 episodes, when that second visit to the mutants' headquarters could probably have been done away with completely and made for a tighter, more deliberately paced, one-part story. So I'm going to give Attack of the Mutant a 1.5 out of 4.